This video will describe some of the various jigs I've been using, including some brand new jigs I just developed that are used to glue up my laminated disc, which produce these laminated disc sets, which in turn are used to produce my Dizzy Bowl projects. In order to produce these Dizzy Bowl projects, these thin laminated discs need to be glued up in layers, rotating each layer by a small amount, typically 2 to 6 degrees, and then glue them back together. It's critical that the same degree of rotation must be repeated for each successive layer. And it's also important that these layers do not slip and slide during the glue-up process. You need to maintain accurate alignment of your disc. The smaller the width of the wood strips in the laminated disc, the more critical this alignment. In some of my recent projects, such as the Dizzy Rings and this micro miniature Dizzy Bowl, these wood strips are as small as 0.10 of an inch. A variation as small as 0.02 of an inch in rotation is noticeable in these projects. In order to accomplish this accurate glue up of the laminated disc, I've been using a series of glue up jigs over the past 2 years, but I recently developed 2 new jigs to improve on the process, and I'll be demonstrating these new jigs in this video. In my earliest videos on producing some Dizzy Bowl projects, I just used some 8 finishing nails with the heads ground off. The jig was created by tracing the outline of the laminated disc on a piece of MDF and then drilling holes to just fit the finishing nails just outside the line on the board. I then cut a piece of plastic the same size as my disc to put on a jig. The purpose of this plastic was just to give me a surface that the glue would not stick to. If I didn't use this piece of plastic, my laminated disc would actually get glued right to the MDF. So the plastic keeps the laminated boards from sticking to the jig. The disc can then be glued up one at a time, placed into the jig, and then the boards aligned to the correct angle. By keeping these discs between these 4 pins, these discs do not slip and slide as they're glued and clamped. So it works out quite nicely for making sure my rings get aligned properly, and also they don't slip and slide as they're being clamped. This jig worked pretty well, but I did discover that the nails were probably a little bit too thin. I had a little bit of flexibility, especially as I added, 5 to 10 discs to the jig. So I thought maybe an option with thicker nails or pins might be a better way to glue up these laminated discs. In subsequent videos, I replaced the finishing nails with small round metal dowels that I purchased from McMaster-Carr. Initially I used some 1/8 inch diameter dowels, but I changed over to 1/4 inch diameter dowels because they were much stronger. Again, I made these jigs by drawing an outline of my disc on a piece of MDF. I then drilled 2 1/4 inch holes close to the line on the board, and then inserted 2 of the metal pins in those 2 holes. For the remaining 2 pins, I actually placed one of the laminated discs on the MDF board, pressed the disc against these 2 metal pins, and then drilled 2 1/4 inch holes as close as I could on the drill press against the laminated disc. The goal was to get an accurate jig with little or no movement of the disc as they were glued up. These jigs work quite well, and I made a lot of projects with this style of jig. The jigs were quite accurate, and I estimated the maximum amount of movement of the disc was less than 0.02 of an inch. However, the main problem with this design is that I needed to make numerous jigs for each project. Even the smallest variation in the diameter of the disc that's being glued up required a separate jig. For most of my projects, I actually made 4 or 5 jigs, which were exclusive to the current project and could not be used for any subsequent projects. In producing these Dizzy Rings and this micro double Dizzy Bowl, I used a slightly different jig. Since the laminated discs for this project were only 1 1/4 inches diameter, I was not able to place pins around these discs and use any clamps to clamp the layers in place. So I drilled a 1/4 inch diameter hole through the center of the disc. I then obtained a 1 1/4 inch diameter Delrin plastic rod and sliced off 1/2 inch thick discs from the plastic rod, and then drilled a 1/4 inch diameter hole through the center. 2 of these Delrin discs were used for each jig. I then placed my metal dowel in the center of the disc and then stacked my laminate discs on top of one another as they were glued, aligned, and then clamped using these jigs. Using the second Delrin disc to clamp and hold everything in place. These jigs work quite well for these small discs. Glue did not stick to the Delrin disc and they could be easily cleaned up and reused many times. I will continue to use these jigs for additional micro Disney projects. This new jig is an improved version of the previous glue jigs, which used the 1/4-inch metal pins. In this new design, the laminated discs are held accurately with no gap between the pins and the disc. Due to the use of these offset cams, it can also be used to glue up discs with minor variations in diameter between the disc sets, and therefore they can be reused for many subsequent disc sets. This will be tested for the first time in this video. Again, I made an MDF board and traced an outline of the laminated disc on the board, and then drilled 2 holes for the 2/4-inch diameter metal pins as was done previously. For these remaining 2 pins, I made these offset pins. 1-inch long brass rods were sliced from a 1/2-inch diameter brass rod. These brass rods were then turned on a metal lathe and finished the surface to produce a nice smooth surface, and both the top and bottom surfaces were squared and polished. Next on my mini lathe, I drilled a small 1/4-inch diameter hole that was slightly offset from center on the brass rod, making sure it was just inside the outer edge of this brass rod. I drilled this hole 3/4 of an inch deep into this 1-inch long brass rod. I then drilled a second 1/4-inch diameter hole on the opposite end of the brass pin. I first of all inserted a 1.5-inch long by 1/4-inch diameter metal pin into the brass rod. The fitting was snug, and I was just able to tap into the hole with a small hammer. In the second hole, I inserted a small 1/8-inch diameter metal pin. This pin serves as a handle to give me some leverage to turn this new offset pin. Next, I drilled 2 more holes into the MDF sheet, but these holes were about 1/8 of an inch outside the line on the board. I then inserted my 2 offset pins into these holes. With this new jig, I'm now able to clamp the laminated discs as they're glued and aligned in the glue jig. And by turning these offset cams, I can lock the disc in place with absolutely no movement between the pins. This gives me a jig that I can use to glue up my laminated disc accurately with no slipping and movement of the disc whatsoever. So let's go now and we'll demonstrate how we actually use this in a glue up process. I have my disc all ready. I have my black line on here, so I'll keep my orientation the same for each of the discs. And I put my plastic piece on my jigs so I don't get glue on my MDF board and going to actually glue this laminated disc to the MDF board. So I align my 2 discs, and then I rotate my 2 pins. So now there's absolutely no lateral movement of this board at all. It's nice in there, nice and tight. And now when I apply my clamps, and I check both sides and they're both aligned perfectly. Let that set for about 2-3 minutes, and then I'll glue the next layer on. So now I can take these clamps off and I'll put this in my press to glue it up. So my top piece here. And this can go on my press to glue it up. And let that dry overnight. Okay, I just removed the glued up laminated disc from my press, and I'm quite pleased with the results. These discs are perfectly, aligned, nice and clean. I'm going to make one modification to the system. However, these handles are a little bit too long, and they need to be able they can slide them in and out, because when I was putting the top disc on, these pieces were in the way a little bit. So I will modify these by making the handles shorter and also making it they slide in and out. Other than that, the system worked quite well, and I'll continue using this in the future. This is another glue-up jig that I'll be testing for the first time in this video. This jig was designed to glue up a wider range of laminated disc diameters and to be able to use these same jigs for multiple projects. Again, I was able to design and build these new jigs using the metal lathe and mini mill recently added to my shop. I actually made 3 sizes of this system to enable me to glue up discs from as small as 2 inches in diameter up to 8 inches in diameter. I needed to make these larger discs because my spring clamps won't go in too far. I couldn't do a 2-inch disc on this larger table, but I can easily do it on the smaller one. So that's why I need 3 different setups for this jig. I began by milling perpendicular slots into MDF boards of different diameters to accommodate T-track, and then this T-track was then glued into these slots. I also finished the surface with some polyurethane to give me a smooth surface so the glue doesn't stick to it as easily. So let me begin by describing the first smaller system. This is the smallest of my jigs that I made up. And I said it consists of this piece of MDF, which is about 6 inches in diameter with my 2 T-slots in. And then I machine these L-brackets. This L-bracket is a piece of aluminum L-bracket. Has a brass slide on the bottom and a thumb screw. And so this brass slide slides into the channel on the T-slot, and then these thumb screws lock it in place. And these brackets are perpendicular, so my slides of my laminated disc will be perfectly straight. So to use this, I would first of all put a piece of plastic in. I don't want to get glue all over my jig, and then I'd be adding my disc one at a time, and then tightening up these thumb screws, and then once they're tightened, my discs are perfectly straight and aligned and with no movement. So I just glue up my disc one at a time, rotating the amount, clamp them, and keep repeating that process as I've done before. So let's go ahead and give this jig a new try and see how it works out. So again, I have my black marks on my disc, so I keep my alignment of the disc going forward. That's good and snug, so let me loosen up 2 of these so I can get the pieces in to start the glue up process. I'll let that set a few minutes until the glue sets up, and then I'll glue up the remaining disc. So what I'm doing here is actually loosening the clamps to get the disc in there, getting it close to position, and then tightening up the clamps. And just making sure they're all tight against that. So there's no lateral movement of these at all now. So now I can just do my final alignment. And again, I'll let that set maybe 10-15 minutes, and then I'll put it in my press for the final glue up. Okay, I just removed the clamps and put all my plastic pieces on top, and I need a small disc to clear the top of the clamps. Clamp that, let that dry for about 3 or 4 hours. I just finished making these 2 sets of laminate discs using this jig with the T-slots and these L brackets with the thumb screws that lock them in place. And I must say I'm quite happy with the results. There was no shifting or moving of the laminate discs in the glue up. These clamps held them nice and straight and accurate. The pieces are nice and straight. They're nice and parallel to one another. The alignment of the layers is right on. So in general I'm quite happy with it, and I will be continuing to use this jig going forward. I've completed the review and testing of my various jigs for making my glued up laminate disc for making my Dizzy Bowl projects. And all these jigs work quite nicely, and any of these would serve your purpose for gluing up your laminate disc. My initial jig, I used a piece of MDF with these 8-penny finishing nails with the heads ground off. This worked quite well. The only disadvantage of this is the nails tended to flex a little bit as I added, 8 or 10 layers of the laminate boards. When I went to the system with the 1/4-inch metal dowels, it worked a little bit better because these dowels are much stronger. And also by being large in diameter, it's easier to align the holes as you're drilling the holes in the MDF board on the drill press. The only disadvantage of this system is if there's any minor variation in the diameter of your disc, you need another jig. And I found myself making 5 or 6 blank jigs for every project to allow for the minor variation in my disc diameters. When I went to this 3rd system with the offset cams, that eliminated that problem. I could have a minor variation in my disc diameter, and these offset cams allowed for that variation. I will be doing a little modification on this to make these pins a little bit shorter because it's a little bit big and a little bit in the way, so I'll be modifying that, but other than that the jig worked quite nicely. My 4th jig also worked quite well. This jig uses some T-slots which are daddled into an MDF board, and I have 3 of these to enable me to glue up laminate boards from 2 inches diameter up to 8 inches diameter. And it uses these L brackets with thumb screws that I can perfectly align and clamp my boards in place. And actually of the systems, this is probably my preference system because I have 3 jigs now that can handle all my laminate boards from 2 inches diameter up to 8 inches diameter. And I don't need to set up a new disc for every new project. I have a bunch of these disc blanks in a drawer from future projects, and I won't need those anymore. I just have 3 jigs that will handle all my project. Allows for variation in the diameter of my disc and allows for additional discs could be glued up. So this will be my choice for my gluing up my laminate disc going forward. For my micro projects, the small project, this jig with the Delrin plastic pieces and the 1/4-inch pin through the center work quite nicely. And this is the jig I'll be using for clamping up my miniature projects, such as my micro and double Dizzy Bowls.